and welcome back to Inspirability. Today we are continuing our conversation with Mandy Hickson, one of the first female fast jet pilots in the Royal Air Force, a published author and a motivational speaker. So Mandy, tell me a bit about your fast jet training and some of the camaraderie you experienced on the course.
Only the bits that are clean enough to repeat here today. No, I'm joking. No, do you know what? I think if there's anything that the military does well, it's the teamwork and that camaraderie and that selflessness of behaviours. Because I think it really came to the forefront for myself was going through RAF Valley and fast jet training on the Hawk. And I was on a course and we'd been together on our elementary training, on our basic training, and now we were in advanced training. So this is our third course together with a pretty much a close-knit, similar group. You had a few people changing on each course dependent on the numbers of the courses. And it was an interesting one because I was quite thick-skinned to behaviours that were being exhibited. And one of the course mates, Tristan, I remember him saying, "Mandy, I hope you don't mind, but I cannot tolerate this any longer. I'm going to have to say something to the boss about the fact that every single instructor makes one comment to you every single day about your gender." And I was like, "What do you mean?" And he said, "Well, you know, like every time you get out of a jet, I hear someone say to you, 'Don't worry, we can tell the jet that Mandy's flown, it's the one that's not parked straight.'" And when I'd sort of go, "Oh, you're very funny," then it would be, the next one would be, "Oh, Mandy's going to be sometime reapplying her makeup." And I'd go, "Yes, of course," because I always wear a lot of makeup. And then if I ever, bit and responded, they'd go, "Oh, obviously she's on her period." So there's all of those ones. Nothing was ever meant maliciously, but it was just 20 people making one comment a day becomes a bit tedious. And that's what they were saying. And it was this really lovely moment where you realise that they weren't being bystanders. They weren't just allowing things to happen around them. They were calling out the poor behaviours. They were the ones that went to the boss and said, "Can you just have a word with all the instructors? Because it's just a bit annoying for Mandy and it's a bit annoying for us." And they all said, "I'm so sorry, Mandy, never even thought about it." And that's sometimes where it's really important. I mean, how does that work? Because this was obviously 25 years ago. What about for yourself, Harriett? Have things changed enormously since that time, I'm hoping?
I think they have changed massively. I think now, I haven't witnessed any behaviours like you were saying, but I think if I did, I think there are a lot of people that now have the confidence to call that behaviour out. And there are mechanisms for reporting that behaviour as well, should it ever happen. So I think it's very different, and it's great to see that things have moved on.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And they had to. And I think, continuing on from that as well, just that level of support that I had. I was about to fail my fast jet training and I went off and I flew a flight and we were doing something called battle turns. So 2 aeroplanes are going off at really, really low level. So we were, in some areas of the country you can drop down to 100 feet, but we were ordinarily at about 250 feet. So height of an electrical pylon. You're hitting speeds of between 420 and 500 miles an hour, depending on whether you're on a target run or not. And you're with a wingman. And you're flying along through the valleys and an instructor's airborne trying to get behind you to simulate shooting you down into your 6 o'clock position. And you've got the one blind spot, which is obviously directly behind you. You can't see, your head literally won't swivel that far. And so that's the moment they're always going to attack you to try to shoot you down. Now, if you're with a pair, because you've got a wingman, their role is to look not in fact just behind you, but in fact 360 around you. But you must coordinate your turns. You can't just turn left because now we're behind each other, so you're vulnerable and exposed. And so we would do this thing called battle turns. And it's when, if we're turning to the right, both aeroplanes pull up. We would cross at a perpendicular angle of exactly 90 degrees. And then when you roll out, you're in perfect formation. Now, it sounds simple, but if you're turning through 32 degrees to the right and then you're adding on a little bit that you need to go beyond, and then I was getting so caught up in the numbers. I was starting to look at the minutiae and not see the bigger picture. And this was just spiralling out of control. My stress levels were through the roof. I don't think I was eating. I wasn't sleeping. I had a skin rash covering my whole body. I went to the doctor and they said, "Have you changed your washing powder?" Because that's how little we talked about mental health in those days. And so I did the worst thing I could do. I isolated myself. I'd go back to my room, shut the door, get my cardboard cockpit out and just sit there speaking to nobody. And that went on for days and days. And on the night before my chop ride, there was a knock on my door. I opened it and it was this young guy called Puppy. My call sign was Big Bird. He was Puppy. Americans get Viper and Maverick. What are we doing wrong? And he said, "Mandy, we're going to take you out this evening." I was like, "I think not, And he said, no, please, will you just trust me?" And he took me down and we got onto our bikes at the bike sheds, which was now a slight concern for me. But we cycled off on our bikes, and when we got to this big parade square, there were a few of the guys around. Some had stuck little wings on their bikes as jokes. Basically, these guys just now spent 3 hours cycling up and down this parade square, yelling 30 starboard, 60 port, rotate, doing all of the battle term manoeuvres that I wasn't able to grasp in the air on the ground. I mean, without the vertical separation, because this is not Harry Potter, okay? And these bikes did not fly. And suddenly everything fell into place. And I just thought, oh my God, that's so easy. Why couldn't I do it before? Well, I'd been stuck in this rut. I'd been doing it in the way I was doing it, getting the same results. And then these guys had gone this extra mile and done this. And when I flew the trip the next day, I said to my instructor, he said, Mandy, that was like flying with a different pilot. From the second I gave you the briefing, you approached that mission like you were a different person. What's happened? And I said, oh, it's really funny. All the team had got me out last night and we'd stuck a bit of wings on. And he said, it's a bit more than funny, because actually for your course, there are only 6 spaces on the next course at the moment to come up to fly Harriers, Jaguars and Tornadoes. And congratulations, man, you're number 7. So actually, although you're not in direct competition with each other, these guys were at that moment guaranteed a space on the next course. But because I'd now got through, one of them would potentially have to wait up to a year now to progress their own career and get onto the next course. And I think when you look at that, you realise what does a high-performing team look like? And it's that thread of trust, which is built up of selfless behaviour. And I don't think that you get that same level of camaraderie in many other organisations.
Yeah, it's looking at the interests of the team over your own interests as much as what they did.
Yeah, completely and utterly. And actually, I've stayed really good friends with all of those guys ever since. And, and I'm sort of godparent to a few of their children and all of that side of things. And actually, it's really lovely to have that sort of relationship. I mean, they were the equivalent of my brothers, which was wonderful.
So one of the things you mentioned when we were talking about this before the show was about the colleagues that you sadly lost. You hadn't planned a mission and they didn't come back. So would you like to just share that story with us?
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think it's particularly pertinent with Remembrance Sunday, and Remembrance Day was yesterday. And I think I'm always really reflective of this time of year, because actually this incident happened in October 25 years ago, and we had a memorial for them. And basically I was up on the operational conversion unit up at Lossiemouth in Scotland. And we were the junior course going through 30 hours on type. And then there's what's called a qualified weapons instructors course. So these were the Top Gun course, so QYs. And they are really talented aviators that have come together from all the different squadrons, and they're going to basically be trained in weaponeering to the highest level, and then they go back as the subject matter experts onto their squadrons. So these are guys at the end of their first, probably second tours. So 6 years of flying, and then they come on this course. So they're the best of the best. And it was the weather was not very good that day. And I happened to be in the planning room, and there was a guy, Dickie Wright, and his navigator, Sean Casabeo, and they were just planning this mission. They'd done it all, and there were all these maps, and this was the day before technology had advanced enormously. And we actually had to get our Pritt stick out and stick the maps together. And he just said, Mans, could you just give me a hand? And I literally remember sticking all their maps together for them and folding them, and then handed them to them while they were running into the briefing room. And then they went off, they flew the mission, and Sean and Dickie never came back. And it was the most horrific experience I have singularly ever had. Because you hear that of 4 ships have gone off and only 3 have come back, and everything suddenly goes into lockdown. So we're just told to sit in a room. No one's allowed to leave that room, because you can't have any cross-contamination. You can't have anybody changing records or things like that. They need to check that the outbrief was done correctly. Was the sortie, was it briefed correctly? Was it authorised? So they need to check all of these things. And yet at the same time, we're not knowing. Now, I have been on squadrons when an aeroplane has crashed, but a pilot ejected. And the first question we always have is, was a parachute seen? And if a parachute was seen, we all breathe a sigh of relief, because we know they'll probably survive. But because there was no parachute seen, and they literally flew into the ground, they must have got disorientated at low level, just near Hickson, near Newcastle. And they didn't come back. And I just remember we went to the bar that evening. We burnt a piano because, as tradition dictates, their bar book is open and every drink goes on them for that night. And it was a Friday, I believe, and I was due to go home that weekend. And I went back to Winchester. And I think I just sat and was in shock, really, and sobbed all weekend. And then went back up to Lossiemouth and carried on with the flying on the Monday morning. And I think, we're all in a state of shock, but in those days, we sort of just all got on with it. But what was even more shocking as well, later that week now, I was airborne and I was on quite a tricky mission. And we heard on the emergency frequency again that a hawk had now crashed in the Lake District. And there aren't that many hawks that are airborne. And I knew that my husband Craig was flying a hawk that day out of Yeovilton, a Navy hawk. And I had to carry on flying that mission, hearing that, again, a hawk had crashed, no parachute seen, and they were scrambling the emergency helicopters and emergency services to go to the Lake District. And we had to carry on with the mission because this was a critical flight for myself. So talk about trying to compartmentalise what's going on, where all you're running through is my fiancé has potentially died, is brutal. And it was not. It was a lovely guy, Steve Todd, that actually was a couple of courses in front of me. And he'd won the Sword of Honour going through Cranwell, really talented aviator. And again, had a malfunction and his aeroplane had crashed. And so we lost him as well. So it was a horrific week for the Air Force and for all that knew all of those pilots.
In terms of compartmentalising, another story you spoke about was miscarriage.
Yeah.
Before you were organising a anniversary celebration. So do you want to share that with us as well?
Yeah, so I was on the squadron and as a junior pilot, you get given a lot of lovely secondary duties. If there's anyone listening from the military, they'll be smiling at that point going, oh yes, because they're everything from T-bar to, I was always entertainments. I don't know why, something to do with my personality, I think. And I was put in charge of organising the squadron's 90th anniversary. Now, 2 Squadron was the oldest fixed-wing squadron in the Air Force, so this was the first of all the squadrons to celebrate this big momentous event, 90 years. And so it's a huge event. We'd organised a mini air show to raise funds for it. And then for the actual event itself, we had a huge hangar party on the Friday night with hog roast, 500-600 people coming, all the ground crew, big barn dance. The next day we had an air show, families open day. Saturday night we had a big black tie dinner, 400 people. I'd got an aircraft in the actual officers' mess, a lovely biplane that had been dismantled and remade. We had a jazz luncheon on the Sunday. So all of these things, and I was in charge of everything. And I had found out I was pregnant about 2 weeks before this and had then been grounded because you can't fly, obviously, when you're pregnant because you get hit in the stomach by a G-suit all the time. Unfortunately, I had had 8 weeks or probably 8 weeks not knowing I was pregnant while I was flying, and that had done the damage. And so I started to have a miscarriage on the Thursday night with the 90th anniversary starting on the Friday. Went to the hospital on the Friday and was told that I had miscarried my baby. And we'd been trying for about a year by now as well. And I was absolutely devastated, but I also knew that I was the officer in charge and had to basically put it aside. And my mum was furious with me. She was going, I don't know what you're doing, just stay at home. But you have a level of responsibility. And again, talk about compartmentalising it. I managed to turn up. I did miss the Friday night, admittedly, but I turned up on the Saturday and no one would have known there was anything wrong whatsoever. And then, of course, come Sunday, everything's done. I've held it together. I've been your perfect junior pilot, organising everything. Sunday, I absolutely crumbled. And yeah, I was truly devastated. But again, I think it just shows a level of professionalism. But it's also really heartbreaking, to actually go through that. And also with no other women on a squadron, you're by yourself going through that. So I remember one wife came up to me and said, Mandy, I've had a miscarriage and I'm so sorry. And I was like, actually, can we not talk about it now? Because if I do, I almost can't go there in my own mind, because if I do, then I'll just crumble. And I think that's, it's probably held me in good stead for many stages of my career, ever since really. But it was pretty brutal.
Did you share the miscarriage story with other members of your squadron? Because again, miscarriage for a long time has been something that we just don't really
talk about. I know. So I hadn't told many people I was pregnant because I was only 11 weeks when I lost it. So we were waiting to 12 weeks to tell people. Everyone kept saying, "Why are you grounded?" I was like, "Oh, I've just got a bit, I've got a bit of an illness or something." And then they'd sorted out me going to do a ground tour because while I was pregnant, you can't fly. So I'd found a posting at High Wycombe in the tornado office so I could do a ground job while I was pregnant. And I remember them saying, "Mandy, what do you want to do now? You're now no longer pregnant. Do you want to go and do the ground tour? Or do you want to stay on the squadron?" And I thought, well, I'm obviously going to want to try to have a baby, and it's probably not conducive to keeping a baby if you carry on flying, but not knowing you're pregnant whilst you're getting hit in the stomach and pulling a lot of G-force. So I thought I'll take the job anyway. And so I was only then on the squadron for another 2 weeks before I left and went off. And in that 2 weeks, they got me back flying, and we had some fantastic last trips. So in some ways, it was probably quite nice because I actually got to do like a swan song of actually flying, and actually that did turn into what I now know to be my last ever trip in the Tornado GR4. So yeah, it was good.
So in terms of then, you were deployed to Iraq as well.
Yeah.
How many times were you deployed to Iraq, and what was that like?
So we would do 3-month detachments. I went over 3 times in a 3-year period, so 9 months in total. We were living in Kuwait, a place called Ali Al Salem, so small airfield just outside Kuwait City. And our job at the time was to defend the no-fly zone over southern Iraq. So it was the build-up to Operation Telic, which was then Gulf War II. And our squadron, we were primarily a reconnaissance squadron, but once you got over there, you would do, bombing as well. So there was a Tornado F3 squadron based out of Saudi, Riyadh, and then we were the ground defence, not ground defence, sorry. We were the ground attack team.
And in terms of also the missile story.
Yeah, sure.
About that one. That's an incredible story.
So, I mean, there was a few very memorable evenings or days when I was over there. I think the first flight was a very memorable one because I went over there, and up to then our squadron had only been doing reconnaissance, and I walked in and they said, "Okay, today's our first bombing mission." I was like, apparently my eyes went like saucers, and the guy running it just said he's never seen anyone look quite so scared on the front. But we did a mission, and actually it was a really good learning point because about a month before deploying out there, I'd been on a trip in the UK with another junior navigator, and we'd gone on our first ever dropping a live weapon. And they make you do this because then you're used to the weight and the responsibility of dropping an actual weapon, live weapon, before you get out to an area of conflict. And you do it at a big range over the sea. And actually, we've discovered on landing that we had dropped the weapon on a very large crest of a wave and not, in fact, on the target because it was painting on the radar. This crest of the wave was very white and dense that my navigator thought that was the target, and we dropped the weapons. And so we were very embarrassed, but we dropped it because we wanted to drop the live weapon. So when I got over to the Gulf and I was on this first ever bombing mission, I remember we were coming in on the target run, and my navigator was sort of going 30 seconds, not identified. And it was this moment where you're thinking, gosh, I'm doing this and we've planned this. And then he said, stop. Switches are made safe. You go off. And he said there's a man and a camel, and they would have been in the injury zone, like the fragmentation zone. And at the time, that was not a high priority target. And so there was no civilian collateral damage. No one could be injured. And so instantly I love that level of black and white. You know what? You have got a mission, but we are not gung-ho. We are not just going to throw away a weapon and potentially injure somebody on the ground, for any reason whatsoever. And I really like that sort of that discipline that we had. And that came as well probably from not dropping that weapon previously because we'd made a poor mistake then. I was not going to make the same mistake twice. At the end of that tour, I was finally put in charge to lead a 4-ship of aircraft with my navigator. And we went off on a mission. And in the run-up to that night, the arterial routes between Baghdad in the north and Al-Basra had always been really busy, and we'd been highlighted by missiles. But along that Saudi border, in 4 months or 3.5 months, nothing had ever happened. It was like completely benign. And as we swept up the last target for the evening, my nav just happened to be wearing his night vision goggles and turned to the right, and he saw a flash of a missile being launched in heat-seeking mode, and that had locked onto my engines. And instantly he just shouted, "Brake right." And so we instantly carried out a manoeuvre which we had practiced, I have to say, hundreds of times before, but never for real. As I chilled my engines, the flares left, and they act as a decoy to this heat-seeking missile, and we watched the missile go from being locked on to our aircraft to pulling off and exploding about 2 miles away, which, as you know, in aeronautical terms, feels like quite a near miss. And I may have uttered a couple of small descriptive words, but then the whole night escalated because instantly, out of those 80 aircraft that are airborne from 4 different countries, from, you know, acting as a coalition with all different roles and different responsibilities, once an aggressive act is made towards any single one of those aircraft, then you are entitled to prosecute an attack on a target. You're given a response option. And our target was a radar station. We later discovered it was that radar station that had handed out the height of our aircraft to an unknown surface-to-air missile cell. So tie together a bit of complacency maybe and latent threats residing in any system, well, then you're at your most vulnerable. Now, the whole mission then changed. We were running out of fuel. We decided that we'd head south into Saudi Arabia to find a tanker, an airborne tanker. And when we got to this tanker, we realised with horror it was not our British one. Ours had broken on the floor and had been replaced by an American KC-135, which I had never tanked from before, and it has a very different refuelling system. And I said to my boss, who was my number 2 in the formation, I said, "Sir, I'm not qualified. I've never done it on this type before." And he said, "Well, have a go." I always think that's a lovely training environment at 3 o'clock in the morning in pitch black in a blowing sandstorm when you've just been shot at.
Low on fuel.
So, yeah, and you're low on fuel. What could possibly go wrong? So anyway, we had 2 attempts and I wasn't successful. And I said to my nav, "I'm stopping." And he said, "Press on." I thought, if I do carry on, it's going to prevent the rest of my team from having a go. You know, we collectively now have got a job to do. And if it doesn't involve me, due to my lack of skill, training or experience, then I have others more qualified. So I overruled him and stepped across onto the wing. My boss, my senior exec, refueled successfully and they went back into Iraq. Myself and number 4 ran out of fuel and had to come back to base, and we landed on absolute fuel minimums. And when I got out the jet, I felt like a complete failure. I was hit by my imposter syndrome. I was hit by you failed your test, you shouldn't be here. You know, what on earth are you doing? You can't even refuel. And then a hand arrives on my shoulder and it's my nav. And he just said, "Mans, that was a really good call." He said, "I'm so sorry. I should never have put you under that pressure." He said, "My last job, I was a trials officer at Boscombe on the strike attack OEU. I'd spent 3 years pretty much on the development and testing of this weapon we're carrying. And it's never been dropped in any theatre of war. And I really wanted to be the first person to drop it in anger." He said, "But fortunately, you were thinking very rationally, not emotionally." And it made me realise that, you know, and you'll have had this as well throughout your career, we talk a lot about psychological safety, don't we? About creating an environment where people feel really open and encouraged to talk and to use their voices, and their voices are heard, and it's safe to do so. And that really hit home to me that night because, you know, there was now some diversity within the team. And if you've got diversity in your team and you encourage younger people to challenge, then you might get a different response than when you're thinking. And that's a really good thing because challenge is always good. And that's what they'd encouraged me to do. And I realised that, you know, the fear that I'd always had was never of being shot down. My fear was always of letting my team down. And I think I realised that night I'd earned my stripes.
It's an incredible story. And in terms of managing the stress, the dealing with, just processing what you went through, you've been shot at. We'd also talked about miscarriage, losing colleagues. What do you do to decompress and how do you manage stress?
Well, I've always been really sporty. So, you know, out in the Gulf, there was a group of us and we all went to the gym every single night, played a lot of squash very powerfully against the wall in very hot conditions as well, I seem to remember. But actually, not as much was done with regards to mental health as it should have been then. And that really reflects in the fact that I think it was about 5 years ago now, I lost 4 friends in 1 year to suicide.
Were they serving friends?
They were all ex-fastjet pilots, all for different reasons, but all within about a 4-month period. And it made me, as I went to funeral after funeral, reflect upon the fact that I think personally we let our forces down for many, many years. Perhaps because of the alpha male environment, perhaps because of the fact that it was put on your big boy shoes and get on with it, you know. And the fact that people didn't feel that they could openly talk about their mental health, because I want people to remember as well that this was a different era. You know, now we have mental first aiders. Now we have programs in place on squadrons for people to talk about things. You have people that are trained, you know, mental health experts as well. And we have so many more charities as well for our veterans when they leave to help, you know. And I've got, you know, and I know that Liz has been on this podcast and she talks very openly about mental health and what has been done about it. And she's a fantastic ambassador for someone that has come through the very darkest day and is now using that story to greater good, to help other people. And she is a phenomenal woman. I have huge respect for her. And I think it's just a shame that society and the forces potentially let her down to let her get to the position she did. And I hope that would not happen now to other people, because it certainly was not as practiced in those days as it is now. So banter was harsh. And I know it sounds ridiculous, but there's a very black humour to the military. And in some ways that does help you, because there is a sort of get on with it sort of mentality. But at the same time, there has to be an outlet. And I think I was always very lucky. I had my husband, Craig. I had a very supportive family. But I also, the fact that Craig was ex-forces himself, would have an understanding of potentially what you've been through as well, although he was in the Navy, so he didn't really do a proper job. I can say that. It's called banter, everybody. I'm joking, before we get all these complaints coming in. But, you know, ultimately he would understand, so we could talk really honestly about things. And in my first tour out there, I was bullied as well, which icing on the cake on specialness. That really did make things pretty dire, to the point where I very nearly handed my notice in. And I thought, this is not the military I thought I was joining.
Did anybody call out that bullying behaviour?
No one called it out when we were out there at all. I got so low about it that I would in the end not actually end up joining any of them outside. Every time I walked outside, if this one individual was there, everyone would just fall silent, because they were obviously talking about me. Every briefing, every single question was directed at me. He started to make my life truly miserable. And all the pernicious comments that would just come my way as backhanders all the time. And no one actually called him out at all for it. And I didn't tell anyone either, because again, I was the only woman out there, and I just thought, just get on with it. But I mean, to give you perspective as well, I mean, as I walked into the building, which was going to be our home for the next 3.5 months, my room was wall-to-wall pornography. Every single surface had pornography on it, really disgusting stuff as well, which I, of course, didn't say, can I have the room next door, which has got nothing in it? I just went, well, it's part of it, isn't it? So I'd strip all the posters off, put it outside and yell, "Porn's up, boys." You know, terrible thing to have to do, but that was the world in which you were in.
Yeah, and you've tried so hard to fit in.
Yeah, of course you have. And what I noticed though, when I got back and I'd said to Craig, I can't do it anymore. This is horrific. And he said that, I'm not letting one man take you down, Mandy. This is ridiculous. And we ended up role playing loads of really, really difficult conversations of how the conversation would go when I did tackle him on it. And the opportunity came about and I tackled him about it. And actually he reflected over the weekend, came back on the Monday and said, I apologise. I did every single thing you said and I'm so embarrassed. I just want to give you some background. My wife had just had our second baby. She was suffering from postnatal depression. She was furious with me for not being there to support her. I was disappointed I couldn't be there to support her. I was angry with the Air Force for not being where I should be. And I took it all out on you. There's no excuse for it, but at least it gave me an understanding. And he said, you probably represented the person that for some reason was the most vulnerable, and I therefore took it out on you. But when you sort of look back, you know, our relationship became much better as a consequence of that honest conversation, and I wish I'd handled it earlier. Or I wish that they had mechanisms in place like they do now, where people can call out those behaviours much, much quicker. And I think I'd gone from this incredibly supportive course going through training to popping out the other end onto a squadron where I only knew one person and they'd never had a female pilot. And there was huge adjustments that needed to be made both ways. But what I saw, this huge transition, was over that in next year, by finally realising I didn't have to just fit in that I could find belonging. Those were two very different places where you're not morphing your behaviours constantly. You actually are bringing your true self to work. And that's where I started off by saying, be unapologetically you, because I realised that was the most important thing I could do. And I saw all those behaviours change on that squadron enormously in that time.
And let's talk about then the embracing a new identity. So then you left the Air Force and then took up a new career. So perhaps you can share with us a bit about that story as to why you left and what you've done since.
So I was hitting the end of my contract. So my 38th birthday, natural point to leave. I assumed I was going to become an airline pilot because that's what every military pilot does when they leave, it seems. So I did all my ATPLs, got my commercial pilot's license, even did MCC, the multi-crew cooperation course, and I'd sort of held this license. But I'll be really honest, my heart was never as into flying commercially as it was for military flying. I loved the raw, low-level fast jet flying. That's what was my absolute passion. And also by now I've got a 4-year-old and a 5-year-old, 2 little boys who are now both just starting primary school. I had a husband who was now in the airlines and was a training captain and was away an awful lot. And I just looked at this scenario and thought, how is this ever going to work if I go into the airlines, you know? And so through a rather fortuitous conversation at a dinner party where I was telling the story about being shot at, and then I was also flying as a volunteer reservist at the weekend to fly air cadets. And I was flying this girl, and she turned into the most talented pilot I've ever flown with in a really raw, natural level. And at the end of this flight, I'd said to her, "You're phenomenal. Is this something you want to do?" And she said, "Oh, I bet you just said it to everyone." I said, "I've never said it to anyone. Is this what you want to do? Because you're really talented." And she looked at me and just said, "Oh my goodness, I never thought I could do this. I was so scared I was going to fail. I decided not to show you I was interested and not to try." And suddenly this whole dialogue.
Syndrome all over again.
Oh my goodness, absolutely. And I said to her, you know, "How are you doing at school?" And she was, "I hate school." You know, and I said, "Well, school enables this." And it really brought that whole sense of purpose and that whole cycle of actually, do you know what? I saw her a year later and she came up to me and she said, "Oh, well, I bet you don't remember me." I thought, well, I better do, because she had a lot of eye makeup on and I sort of recognised that. And I said, "Emily," and she said, "Oh, Mum, I'm just so pleased you're here. I wanted to tell you I got all my exams and I want to be a pilot just like you." And it was these 3 words, "just like you," because I just got my licenses. And I thought, actually, just like you, I have now got this amazing opportunity where I am. I couldn't see a way forward with me going into the airlines, with my husband doing it as well. I'd had this fortuitous conversation with someone at a dinner party who said this would make a brilliant speech. And I started to put together a plan of taking all these lessons from aviation, all the lessons that we learned through our human factors training, our crew resource management, and taking those out into schools and businesses. And I started off by speaking to schools. And in the last 12 years, I now have finally worked out, I've spoken to over 100,000 school children in all 5 continents, which I'm very, very proud of. In lockdown, I spoke to over 100 air squadrons and university air squadrons as well, so air cadets. And I think I realised that my superpower, if you'd like to say, would be creating a legacy of change, ensuring that that ladder that I had climbed up and that my colleagues and my friends like Joe Salter and Kirsty Murphy and those female aviators around me, we'd all climbed up this ladder, and now that ladder was down. We needed to make sure it was down and welded, and that others would be able to follow up with much more ease than there had been for us. And actually, that is what has now become most important to myself, creating a legacy of change for the future.
You have created an incredible legacy, and you've been such a trailblazer as well. And having these conversations, I think, is really important, talking about change, calling out behaviour, mental health, and also talking about miscarriage as well. It's something that still isn't talked about enough.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
The story is incredible, and hearing everything that you've been through and your resilience and your persistence has just been, I mean, I feel just hearing you just so overwhelmed and so impressed. So I've absolutely loved this conversation with you, Mandy. So thank you.
My pleasure.
I have one final request for you.
Yeah.
So your book is an incredible read. I've really enjoyed reading it, and I'd be absolutely honoured if you'd mind.
Oh, be delighted to. Have you got your copy?
I have. I've got my copy right here.
Oh, look, it's hidden. That's it.
Thank you so much for your time.
My absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. Honestly, it's been lovely. Really great to chat to you. Thanks, Harriett.
I look forward to seeing what you do next. And I think you've created an incredible legacy, and you're still creating an incredible legacy.
Oh, thank you. I have to say it's been really lovely, and it's a voyage that I never really thought I would take. And actually, you know, things that I never thought I would do, which would be being asked to be a Royal Air Force Charitable Trust trustee, being an aviation ambassador, things that Mandy from Manchester, I hope, would be very proud of in seeing, you know, what you can achieve when you actually put yourself out there, show vulnerability, be honest and be yourself.
You've created so many opportunities as well, just through everything you've done, and you've been a visible role model, which I think is a huge inspiration for many of us.
It's lovely, I have to say. So Jo Salter, who was the first female fast jet pilot, and myself were wandering around the Royal International Air Tattoo this year, and we were mobbed by air cadets coming up going, Mandy, Jo, I can't believe it. And they made us go into this, oh my goodness, into their virtual reality, like doing all the flight simulators. They got us doing a virtual reality shooting game, of which we were annihilated. We were the worst team. We didn't kill anyone in the game, and we were shot something like 17 times between us. We were absolutely horrific. So it was quite funny, but it was great, and it just made us realise, you know, the impact that we are having as well, which is really nice.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Harriett.